Imagine a being exactly like you in every physical aspect. Its brain has an identical structure, the same neural connections, and it even reacts in the same way to external stimuli. If you observed it from the outside, you would see it smile, cry, talk about its musical tastes, and even complain about toothaches, just as any human would. However, according to the idea of the philosophical zombie, this duplicate lacks any kind of inner experience. It feels nothing, has no sensations, and no inner voice that speaks to it. It acts as if it had consciousness, but deep down, it is empty. This thought experiment arises to question the relationship between brain states, everything physical that happens in our body, and subjective experience, what we feel from the inside. This inner experience is called qualia, the sensation of seeing a color, tasting something sweet, or feeling joy or sadness. The philosophical zombie appears to have qualia, but it is pure mechanism with no real inner experience. Could such a being exist in our world, exactly like a human in its behavior, but without consciousness? The possibility of these philosophical zombies was defended, among others, by the philosopher David Chalmers, who used it to argue that consciousness cannot be fully explained by purely physical or neurobiological theories. For him, even if we knew in detail how electrical impulses travel in the brain, and even if we understood every chemical reaction of our neurons, that would not be enough to explain why we experience being conscious. Behind neuronal activity, there is something more: the subjective experience of things. The underlying question is whether it is logically conceivable for a zombie to function exactly like a human, but without consciousness. Does that mean that science does not depend solely on the physical? Those who answer yes generally adhere to dualist positions, or at least to views that are not strictly materialist. They argue that if it were possible to conceive of a zombie indistinguishable on the outside from a real person, then consciousness contains an irreducible component, something that cannot be exhausted by mere chemistry or brain organization. On the other hand, materialists or hard physicalists respond that the zombie hypothesis is a simple conceptual illusion. They say that if a being behaves in exactly the same way as we do, talking about its toothache, remembering the taste of its favorite food, or explaining its sadness over the loss of a loved one, then that being must necessarily have internal states that lead it to express itself in that way. In other words, there cannot be the behavior of feeling pain without there being a real support of consciousness. For these thinkers, the same neural structure that makes it possible to talk about the color red or the beauty of music is what creates the experience of red and subjective beauty. In this way, an identical brain with the same configuration would imply an identical consciousness, and for that reason they consider the existence of philosophical zombies impossible. The controversy intensifies when we examine what we mean by possible. Is it enough for something to be imaginable to consider it a valid hypothesis? Chalmers and others claim that if we see no logical contradiction in its conception, that is sufficient to speak of its possibility. In contrast, materialists insist that imaginable does not equal possible in the real sense, especially if our intuition does not fit with the laws that govern the universe. After all, we can also imagine round triangles, but that does not make them coherent. This thought experiment opens up an enormous debate about the explanation of consciousness. On one hand, consciousness is seen as the hard problem of the philosophy of mind, because it is not enough to describe physical functioning. There is a leap to subjective experience that remains a mystery. On the other hand, we have more reductionist explanations that claim all experience derives from neuronal processes. One of the most famous examples of those who deny that a philosophical zombie could exist is the thinker Daniel Dennett, who maintains that talking about a being identical in physical and behavioral terms, but without consciousness, is simply a contradiction. Why does this topic interest us beyond intellectual curiosity? Understanding the nature of consciousness could radically change our understanding of ourselves and the world. Imagine, for example, that we create super advanced androids with artificial brains almost identical to ours, and that they display complex behaviors such as empathy or creativity. Would they have consciousness? If they do, How would we know? And if they did not, would they be merely philosophical zombies, repeating patterns without inner experience? The answer would directly influence how we would treat them morally and legally. It also connects with pain and pleasure. The zombie could shout, "Ow, it hurts," without feeling any suffering. It could talk about its favorite sport without enjoying the adrenaline that comes from practicing it. Even if its behavior were perfect, it would not experience joy, love, or fatigue. This opens the door to ethical dilemmas. If such zombies existed, should we consider them persons with rights? And we ourselves, what exact relationship do we have with our brain to ensure that there really is consciousness and that we are not simply super complex automatons? Defenders of philosophical zombies emphasize that, starting from brain activity, it has not been possible to satisfactorily explain why the color of our experiences exists. For them, that extra something points to consciousness being a distinct phenomenon that cannot be deduced from the physical alone. On the other side, critics reply that everything will sooner or later be reduced to biology, and that we simply need better theories and greater technology to map the way the brain produces subjective experience. Ultimately, the philosophical zombie remains a mirror that makes us question what we are in essence. Are we something more than the physical chemical processes of our brain? Or is consciousness an epiphenomenon that, although it seems mysterious, can be explained as a consequence of neural activity? We may not have a definitive answer for now, but the question alone pushes us to reflect on the nature of our existence. So the next time you wonder how you know that those around you are really conscious, or why you yourself possess an inner world, remember the philosophical zombie. It is a reminder that consciousness, so obvious in everyday life, remains an enigma for science and philosophy. Perhaps it is enough to recognize the wonder of being awake on the inside, and that mystery, far from disturbing us, can inspire us to keep searching for answers about who we are and what it truly means to have an inner life. After all, that sense of wonder is the engine that has fueled human curiosity for centuries and will continue to do so as long as there are deep questions left to discover. Imagine that you are standing in front of a button that with just one press would transport you to a perfect universe. There, every sensation would be pleasant, every moment would make you smile, and life would seem like a wonderful movie without conflicts or sadness. This ideal world would be achieved thanks to the experience machine, a concept proposed by the philosopher Robert Nozick. His idea is simple but profound. Would you accept living in a simulation that offered you only happiness, knowing that none of it would be real? To better understand the question, imagine that technology is so advanced that it can connect your brain to a network of illusions. Everything you perceive in that state will seem absolutely authentic. The warmth of the sun, the breeze brushing your face, the laughter of your loved ones, the triumphs and the most intense passions. However, deep in your mind, you will know that none of that is happening in the real world. You would be lying in some kind of capsule or futuristic bed with electrodes on your head, receiving impulses designed to let you enjoy constant happiness. On one hand, it might sound tempting, right? Especially on a gray day full of stress or worries, when nothing seems to go right. You might think, if I could escape these problems and enjoy a perfect existence, why not do it? After all, the promise of eternal joy sounds very sweet. But the issue Nozick raises is more complex. He asks whether we truly value happiness above truth. Is the sensation of pleasure above knowing that what we are living is authentic? Or is it more valuable for us to face reality with its ups and downs, with the possibility of failure, but also with the merit that each experience is genuine? There are people who would answer without hesitation that yes, they would plug in immediately. In their view, what matters is how we feel, and if reality can be so harsh and cruel, what is the point of suffering if we could choose absolute bliss? After all, our mind processes events internally, so the experience of being happy would be the same, subjectively speaking. For these supporters of the machine, the key lies in the fact that we would see no difference between a true situation and a simulated one, as long as it provides us with the same experience of joy. However, there is another side of the coin. Many refuse to press that button, arguing that reality and authenticity matter. The machine may promise pleasure, but everything would be false. There would be no achievements earned through your real effort, nor relationships that have grown through life's trials. There would be no pain or suffering. Yes, but there would also be no genuine learning, no opportunity to get to know yourself in difficult situations, and no feeling of having truly overcome challenges. For these people, the value of life lies in the fact that happy moments come accompanied by obstacles that have been overcome. Fulfillment takes on a special tone when it is experienced based on events that are not controlled by a simulation. Another interesting aspect is that of free will. Inside the machine, almost everything would be predetermined to please us. But how free would we really be in that perfect world? If someone or something else designs our pleasurable experiences, could we truly make decisions that change the course of our virtual story, or would everything be pre-programmed? Would you feel comfortable knowing that even though everything is pleasant, that everything was not forged by your effort, but by code and programming created to ensure you do not suffer? In addition, Nozick invites us to think that, although pain is unpleasant, it also allows us to grow. Without adversity, you might never develop virtues such as resilience, strength, or empathy. Sometimes our difficult moments are what make us truly appreciate times of joy. If everything were pleasure all the time, would we come to value that pleasure, or would it become monotonous and devoid of meaning? Of course, there is no single answer to this dilemma. Some would feel perfectly comfortable immersing themselves in perpetual illusion, while others would reject the proposal outright and prefer authentic reality with all its imperfection. What is most valuable is the reflection that arises when you place yourself in that dilemma. It forces you to ask yourself, what am I really looking for in life? An experience that makes me feel good, regardless of its origin, or a connection with what I consider true, even when that involves risks and suffering. At its core, this question resonates with something very human, the desire to know what is real and what is not. The idea of living in a dream, even if it is a beautiful dream, awakens a certain unease. Think, for example, about relationships with other human beings. If in the machine you find the ideal person who always understands you, loves you, and never argues with you, is that love as valuable as one that is forged day by day through arguments and reconciliations, moments of vulnerability, and instances of genuine complicity? For some, the mere idea that everything is prefabricated strips the experience of its charm. For others, love would feel just as real, since our emotions would function in the same way. Whatever your position, the experience machine teaches us that happiness is not the only factor we value. We want joy, yes, but also authenticity and freedom. In some way, that touch of uncertainty that makes life genuine suggests that we need to feel somewhat at the mercy of chance, of our own decisions and those of others, for our stories to take on a unique meaning. If everything were guaranteed happiness, would it make sense to talk about courage, creativity, or perseverance? Those qualities tend to shine precisely in the face of adversity. So, if you stop for a moment to reflect, what would you do if you were offered this possibility? You might even imagine yourself walking down a white hallway with soft lights, and at the end, seeing the capsule that would connect you to the machine. To the side, a sign might read, "Promise of continuous happiness." Would you take the step? Would you lie down confidently, ready to let electrical signals envelop you in an endless refuge of peace? Or would you stop for a second before doing so, remembering that outside that capsule there are pain and uncertainty, but also the possibility of authentic love, true experiences, and real progress born from your own actions? Ultimately, the answer may depend on how much value you place on truth, freedom, and the growth that comes from facing life as it is. Behind that small question, would you connect to the experience machine? There is a great philosophical debate that touches the heart of what it means to be alive. And perhaps as you close your eyes tonight and let your mind relax, you can play with the idea of a dreamed world in which everything goes well, or remember that sometimes the beauty of existence is enhanced thanks to contrasts. Regardless of what you think, this thought experiment by Nozick brings us closer to a deeper understanding of our priorities as human beings. And after all, that is the true purpose of these reflections, to discover what we value most in the adventure of living. Imagine that at this very instant, all your certainties dissolve like dust in the wind. Think that every color you see, every sound you hear, and even every sensation you feel could be a carefully designed trick meant to deceive you. There is nothing that can assure you 100% that this world is real, except your experience of being aware that you are thinking. This is the heart of the idea of the evil genius of René Descartes, a hypothesis in which an all-powerful and cunning being can manipulate your perceptions and make you believe that the world is one way, when in truth it could be another, or perhaps not exist as you perceive it at all. Descartes wanted to find something so firm that no trick or deception could tear it down. But to reach that unshakable foundation, he first had to doubt everything. The reality his senses showed him, what he learned in school, books, and even mathematics. How could he do that? He imagined this evil genius, also called the deceiving demon, with the ability to present a perfect illusion before his eyes. In this way, Descartes asked himself whether there was something that not even such immense power could falsify. That radical doubt, which today may sound a bit frightening, was for Descartes a necessary step in the search for truth. If there were a very powerful genius capable of confusing our senses and even our minds, how would you distinguish what is true from what is false? But no matter how perfect a liar this genius might be, there was one crucial detail it could not falsify: the very fact that in doubting, we exist as thinking beings. That is why Descartes arrived at his famous conclusion: I think, therefore I exist. Cogito ergo sum in Latin. As long as it is I who experiences doubt, something of me must be there. Imagine an expert magician who appears on a grand stage with smoke, lights, and dazzling tricks. This magician makes you see rabbits coming out of a hat, scarves changing color, and cards disappearing from his hand. However, no matter how surprising and realistic the act is, you know it is an illusion, a trick. But in the case of the evil genius, the trick would be so perfect that you would have no way to unmask it. Your sight, your hearing, your touch, absolutely all your senses would be under its spell. So, if everything could be a deception, what remains? Descartes' answer to this question is the awareness of your own thinking. Even if the evil genius rewrote your reality, it could not erase your ability to realize that you are doubting. That awareness of doubt becomes the strongest proof that something of you is real. It may seem like a simple point, but it is very profound. Even if what we see were a constant dream or a macabre ruse, the experience of being conscious, of thinking about those doubts, is undeniable. Why is this thought experiment so important? Because it helps us question the blind trust we place in what we perceive. It invites us to examine what we believe we know and to seek more solid foundations for knowledge. Although today it is not very common for people to imagine an omnipotent demon deceiving us at every step, Descartes' idea opened the door to critical reflection and to the possibility that the world is not exactly as our senses tell us it is. This thought does not have to be frightening. It can actually be an exercise in calm. By stopping for a few minutes to think that what we consider certain might not be so certain, we can learn to relax amid uncertainty. After all, if even our perception of the world could be an ingeniously produced dream, what do we have left? We have the certainty that whatever we may be, we are here in this moment, present, feeling, and living. And that inner experience, that awareness of yourself, is something the evil genius cannot access so easily. This radical doubt also shows us that in a certain sense, we are freer than we think. If we realize that even the most basic concepts can be questioned, why not explore life with an open mind? The trick of the evil genius invites us to humility. Perhaps we do not know everything, and we are probably mistaken about more than one thing. However, that possibility of error is the seed that drives us to seek, to learn, and to look at reality with curious eyes instead of fearful ones. Think about it when you close your eyes and let yourself drift into sleep. If a being as powerful as this evil genius existed, it could transform the music you hear into unrecognizable whispers, make your pillow feel like grass, or turn the sound of rain into the hum of a gigantic machine. But even in that altered world, something inside you would know that you are present. That moment of awareness, however faint it may be, would confirm that there is a you thinking, living, and feeling. It is possible that in everyday life, you do not need to go that far in your reflections to know that you need to eat, work, or laugh with your friends. But it is worth contemplating these thought experiments from time to time. They help you put into perspective what you consider true and what may be nothing more than the tip of an iceberg of perceptions. Some people are frightened by the idea of what if everything is an illusion, but it can also be turned around and seen as something wonderful. The human mind can imagine so many possibilities. Descartes' evil genius is not a monster that comes to torment you. It is rather a tool that helps you reflect on your experience of existing. Sometimes, the questions that generate a little fear are the ones that push us the most to grow. That little voice that makes you doubt can become your best companion in learning because it teaches you not to take anything for granted. Remember that even under the greatest deception, there is a corner of your being that is awake and attentive, that silent point that perceives doubt and therefore confirms your existence. So the next time you get ready to relax and sink into a deep sleep, let your mind wander for a few moments through these philosophical territories. Imagine that around you, the evil genius could be transforming everything. Feel the softness of your pillow and ask yourself whether it really is as soft as you think or if it is just a trick. Notice how you breathe, how your eyelids slowly close, and realize that in the end, the most real thing you have is that inner awareness that lets you notice that you exist. That cannot be faked. That is you. Sleep peacefully, knowing that even if the world around you were an illusion, your experience of being present is your anchor to reality. That small certainty goes with you wherever you go, in every breath, in every beat of your heart. We may not be able to prove with absolute certainty everything that surrounds us, but we can embrace the certainty that something within us realizes that we simply are. And for today, that is enough. Rest and dream with the gentle doubt that deep down reminds us how incredible the simple fact of being truly is. Imagine that one day, unexpectedly, you come across a mysterious ring that makes you invisible the instant you slip it onto your finger. No one can see or hear you while you wear it. Suddenly, you feel an almost unlimited freedom. You could enter any place, uncover unspeakable secrets, and do things that under normal circumstances you would never attempt for fear of the consequences. This is the famous Ring of Gyges, a story Plato recounts in the Republic to pose a profound ethical dilemma. If people had nothing to fear, would they still act justly? According to the story, a shepherd named Gyges finds, after a strange earthquake, the corpse of a giant who is wearing a ring with extraordinary powers. When he puts it on, he discovers that his body becomes invisible. Thanks to this discovery, Gyges is able to enter the royal palace, seduce the queen, conspire against the king, and seize power. And he does so without fear of punishment, because no one can see him. Plato presents this story as a tale that leads us to reflect on human nature and morality. Are we good because of inner conviction, or simply out of fear of being discovered and punished? For some, the moral is clear. Without the watchful eyes of others, many would fall into selfish or violent acts. In this way, goodness would depend on social pressure and on the possibility of receiving punishment if we break the rules. From this point of view, most people would behave well not out of love for justice, but because the law and public scrutiny force them to do so. In the case of Gyges, his moral transformation would be proof that once the brake of responsibility is removed, anyone would feel free to do whatever they want. But would we all really act that way? For Plato, the story of the ring is a provocation, a way of making us ask why we do what we do. It confronts us with the idea that even if we had the opportunity to commit dishonest actions without legal or social repercussions, we might reject that temptation because we have deeply rooted personal values. Plato, through the voice of Socrates, argues that justice should not be sought solely to avoid sanctions, but because it is a good in itself. In the long run, a truly just person leads a more harmonious and happy life. In this sense, the story also invites us to examine what is meant by happiness. If gaining wealth, power, or illicit pleasures were as easy as putting on a ring, would it be worth it if deep down we had to carry guilt, hypocrisy, or a lack of integrity? What kind of satisfaction would that life based on deception leave us? Plato points out that the heart of justice lies in inner harmony. For him, a just person is at peace with themselves, because their reason, emotions, and impulses are in balance. When thinking about the ring of Gyges today, we can transfer it to everyday situations. For example, in the digital world, we sometimes feel invisible behind an anonymous profile on the internet. Do we take advantage of that condition to insult or defame mercilessly, protected by the idea that no one will know who is behind it? Or do we maintain the same ethical standard we have face-to-face? Every time someone cheats on an online exam, shares files illegally, or mocks others on social media, they could be experiencing something similar to wearing the ring of Gyges. The question is whether that possibility of hiding one's identity brings out a darker side, or whether personal values remain firm even when no one is watching. For some philosophers and psychologists, moral conscience is an inner sense that cannot be turned off so easily. Yes, there will be those who give in to the temptation of unlimited power, but there are also people who, even having every opportunity to be dishonest, choose to act with integrity. These people find value in honesty itself and in the social bonds that are forged by being genuinely good, not merely by avoiding punishment. That is why the story of Gyges is not only a tale of temptation and corruption, it is also an invitation to recognize our own capacity to choose what is right, even when we could get away with doing the opposite. On the other hand, if everyone wore one of these rings, could an orderly society exist? Plato suggests that without fear of consequences, many rules would collapse, creating chaos in which each person would seek their own advantage. However, this hypothetical scenario also encourages us to think about the possibility that human beings, by understanding the benefits of living justly, might choose to cooperate rather than exploit others. We could then ask whether the true basis of justice is the imposition of sanctions or the shared understanding that the common good creates well-being for all. In the end, Plato suggests that virtue and justice must be cultivated from within. If one acts correctly only out of fear, ethics are reduced to a mere strategy to avoid trouble. But if justice is understood as a personal and social balance, it ceases to be a simple external obligation and becomes a choice that gives meaning to life. With the ring of Gyges, Plato does not intend to claim that everyone would be corrupted, but rather to make us reflect on the fragility of our morality when we believe ourselves exempt from consequences. What do you think? Do you believe that with the promise of absolute impunity, you would act without remorse, seeking your personal benefit at all costs? Or that your values would lead you to reject actions that harm others even when no one could blame you? These questions do not have a single or definitive answer. In fact, their purpose is precisely to make us doubt, exploring that tension between the desire for total freedom and the need for an ethical order that keeps us in harmony with those around us. Ultimately, the myth of the Ring of Gyges is an open door to introspection. It is a reminder of the importance of asking ourselves who we are when no one is watching. If justice exists only because of surveillance, perhaps it is not true justice, but a facade. On the contrary, if we find within ourselves a reason to be just beyond punishment, we are discovering the essence of a virtuous life. one that does not need magical rings or masks to express itself. So the next time you feel tempted to take advantage of a situation of invisibility or anonymity, remember the story of Gyges. Think about whether what defines your conduct is fear of what others will say, or the genuine conviction that there are values worth respecting. And in that encounter with your own conscience, you may find that integrity does not depend on the world watching you, but on you being aware of the person you are becoming. And that, in the end, may be the most valuable lesson Plato wanted to share with us through this fascinating story. Imagine that you could travel into the past in a sudden impulse that defies all logic. You decide to eliminate your own grandfather before he ever meets your grandmother. If you succeeded, he would never have children, and therefore you would not exist. But if you do not exist, who made the trip into the past to carry out that act? This puzzle is known as the grandfather paradox and is one of the most famous dilemmas when we talk about time travel. At first glance, it seems impossible, a dead end that shakes our understanding of cause and effect. However, different theories have emerged that try to explain it and give it coherence. Let us look at the best-known ones. First, think about the most classical conception of the paradox, the one that arises from the idea of a single universe and a single timeline. According to this version, time is rigid. What has happened cannot be altered in any way. So how is it that fiction and imagination show us time travelers modifying events? One possible explanation is that no matter how hard you try, something will always happen to prevent you from altering history in a radical way. Perhaps your weapon jams at the last moment, an unexpected accident occurs, or you simply do not encounter your grandfather where you thought he would be. This is known as the Novikov self-consistency conjecture. The laws of physics and causality prevent you from carrying out actions that would generate logical contradictions. Under this view, the past protects itself so that history does not break. Another way to resolve the paradox is to resort to the idea of multiple realities. Imagine that the timeline is not a single unbreakable track, but an infinite fan of possibilities. In this model, by going back and eliminating your grandfather, you would not be altering your own original timeline, but rather creating or jumping to a parallel reality in which you would never be born. That would not affect the line you come from. The universe would simply branch into two, one where your grandfather lived and you exist, and another where he is gone, and therefore you would never come to exist. In this way, the contradiction is avoided because in your line of origin, nothing has really changed. Traveling to the past generates a different universe, not an alteration of the one you originally knew. And what about the version in which you somehow do manage to commit the act and still return to the future to discover a different scenario? Here, more radical fictional scenarios come into play, where the present is rewritten. In theory, you would cease to exist immediately. But how could you disappear if you have already traveled to the past? This is where time becomes a tangled mess, and the most convoluted explanations appear, explanations that are directly impossible in a logical sense. That is why many scientists and philosophers tend to hold that either time travel as we imagine it is not feasible, or that if it were, reality would have natural mechanisms, physical or otherwise, that would prevent these traps of causality. Even so, simply posing the grandfather paradox serves to reflect on our understanding of before and after. We normally assume that the cause occurs before the effect, and that the future is something that has not yet happened, and therefore cannot influence the present. But with the possibility of time travel, these assumptions are turned upside down. We could, for example, receive a message from a future self, warning us of a catastrophe. Or is it inevitable that time behaves in a linear and strict way that we cannot reverse? For many people, the paradox invites them to think more broadly about how events are intertwined. It is somewhat similar to those dreams in which events do not seem to follow a rational order. However, when it comes to real physics, most serious theories about time travel are based on Einstein's general relativity and on the mathematics of wormholes or closed time-like curves. These theories, although fascinating, have not yet shown that we can travel to the past in a practical way, and usually propose very specific limitations to prevent causality from breaking. Another interesting perspective is to see the paradox as a philosophical question rather than a physical one. What matters is not so much whether we can or cannot kill our grandfather, but what all this tells us about our beliefs regarding free will. If we could go back and change something as decisive as the life of our ancestor, would that mean that our future is written in stone? Or, on the contrary, that we could rewrite it? And if we rewrite it, would we still be the same person? We can even ask what role identity plays if changing the past alters the conditions that shaped your memories and personality. Would you still be you when you return to the present? To relax while reflecting on this thought experiment, you can imagine a calm scene. You are sitting before a portal that opens in the middle of nowhere, with the opportunity to go back in time and observe your grandfather in his youth. Perhaps you see him walking under the sun on an ordinary day you had never imagined. You notice that he is not yet married and has no family responsibilities. The thought that with a single decision you could erase your own existence is overwhelming. Would you dare to intervene? Or would you understand that your story is already written in every atom, and that even if you leap from one era to another, there are forces that maintain order? It is possible that in the end, the grandfather paradox has no definitive solution that satisfies everyone, since it rests on the tension between logic and what intuitively seems impossible. What it certainly does achieve is to stimulate the imagination and remind us that time is an extremely complex concept. At the same time, it invites us to review our convictions. How much does our present depend on each small action of our ancestors? How would we define ourselves if we had the power to rewrite our roots? Perhaps the gentlest lesson of this dilemma is to recognize that each of us is the result of a unique and unrepeatable path in which countless coincidences and causal chains have brought us here. Doubting this and assuming it could have been altered is a mental game that, rather than producing anguish, can lead us to value the reality we live. So, as you let yourself drift into sleep, you can continue to ask yourself what you would do if you held the keys to time in your hands. Perhaps instead of erasing the past, you would prefer to immerse yourself in the wonder of knowing that with every decision, stories are built that in most cases escape our control entirely. And in the end, it may be precisely that uncertainty that makes life something so extraordinary. Imagine two particles that are born at the same time in a laboratory and then separate over great distances, even light years apart from one another. However, when you measure certain properties in one of them, the other reacts or responds as if both were still invisibly connected. At first glance, this seems like pure science fiction, but in reality, it is the heart of the famous EPR experiment, proposed in 1935 by Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen. Their goal was to point out a possible flaw in quantum theory and to argue that perhaps nature contained hidden variables that we still did not understand. To understand this experiment, let us break down its elements in a simple way. First, keep in mind the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. When two particles are generated together, for example, two photons arising from the same process, they can become quantum mechanically linked. This means that certain properties, such as spin or polarization, remain correlated no matter how far apart they are. When you measure the property of one particle, that measurement seems to instantaneously define the corresponding value in the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein described this as spooky action at a distance because it challenged his idea that nothing can travel faster than light. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen were not satisfied with the usual interpretation of quantum mechanics, known as the Copenhagen interpretation, associated with Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. According to this interpretation, before a measurement is made, the properties of particles are not defined in a classical sense, but instead exist in a kind of probabilistic superposition. Only when we measure do we force the particle to choose one of the possible values. To Einstein, this sounded too strange, because it implied that the universe operated in a probabilistic and incomplete way at fundamental levels. He believed there had to be a deeper theory with hidden variables that would give us a deterministic picture and explain why particles seem to share information so quickly. The paper published in 1935 presented a thought experiment. Two entangled particles separate. By measuring a certain property of the first, the property of the second becomes immediately known. If quantum theory were correct, it seemed as though information about which result to obtain in the second particle traveled instantaneously from the first to the second, contradicting Einstein's relativistic view that nothing can propagate faster than light. To resolve this contradiction, EPR argued that quantum mechanics must be incomplete. Perhaps the particles already had defined values from the beginning, that is, hidden variables, but we did not yet have the theory needed to describe them. The big question was, does this instantaneous communication really occur, or is there something more subtle that we do not understand? For decades, the debate over the completeness of quantum mechanics and the existence of hidden variables remained in a philosophical limbo. The mathematics of quantum physics predicted astonishing results, but there was no way to experimentally test whether there was some trick that allowed a local explanation in which everything propagates at subluminal speeds. In the 1960s, the physicist John Bell proposed a revolutionary criterion to move this discussion from philosophy to the laboratory, the so-called Bell inequalities. These inequalities established concrete limits on the correlations that could exist between measurements of two particles under the assumption that nature is local, meaning that no effect is transmitted instantaneously. If experiments showed correlations greater than those established by Bell, it would demonstrate that the world does not fit with a local hidden variable theory, and that the quantum predictions were correct, even if they were counterintuitive. At the beginning of the 1970s, and more famously in 1982, the physicist Alain Aspect and his team carried out crucial experiments with pairs of entangled photons. They observed correlations that clearly violated Bell's inequalities, matching what quantum mechanics predicted. These results shook the traditional view. It appeared that nature is indeed non-local in the quantum sense. However, it is important to clarify that this does not imply the possibility of sending messages at infinite speed. In fact, quantum mechanics imposes other restrictions that prevent the transmission of useful information faster than light. The EPR experiment and the subsequent tests of Bell have generated different interpretations of how to understand this non-locality. One of them is the many worlds interpretation, according to which the universe branches into multiple simultaneous outcomes with each measurement. Another is the Copenhagen interpretation, which maintains the idea of a collapse of the wave function upon measurement. There are also versions of non-local hidden variable theories, such as that of David Bohm, in which there truly is an instantaneous connection at the quantum level, but relativity is not violated in the way one might think. The fundamental point is that, thanks to the experiments inspired by EPR, we know that quantum reality cannot be fully explained using the logic of classical physics. Entanglement is real and suggests that the separation between two particles is not as absolute as we once believed. This forces us to redefine our notions of cause and effect and what it means to be isolated in the universe. Although we still do not have a final and universal answer to the great mysteries surrounding these phenomena, EPR and the subsequent experimental tests have opened the door to a much richer, more connected, and more surprising view of the world. Even so, it is easy to misinterpret this quantum connection and think that we can send telepathic messages or manipulate objects at a distance with the mind. Quantum mechanics is extraordinary, but it does not break the laws of physics in that sense. In fact, for one person to learn the result of a measurement on the other particle, additional information must be transmitted in a classical way, for example, through conventional means, respecting the speed of light barrier. To relax with these ideas in mind, Imagine for a moment two cosmic dancers who, after a shared act of creation, move away from one another. Yet every step one takes seems to resonate in the other, regardless of the distance. They may not be able to send messages or signals, but something keeps their movements synchronized at a deep level, a mysterious bond that unites them beyond what we can see or touch. That is the essence of quantum entanglement that fascinated and at the same time frustrated Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. Ultimately, the EPR experiment teaches us that reality may be more intricate than our intuitions suggest. The idea of a universe in which everything is entangled at unsuspected levels can be unsettling, but it is also full of wonder. In the end, quantum mechanics continues to work with incredible mathematical precision, enabling technological advances such as future quantum computers, quantum cryptography, and other innovations that depend precisely on these spooky phenomena. So if one night you fall asleep thinking about how two distant particles can be connected, let yourself be carried by curiosity. We may not find a definitive answer anytime soon, but the search itself is part of the adventure of modern physics. With each new experiment, we understand a little better the delicate web of reality, where time, distance, and the boundaries between the possible and the impossible become somewhat more flexible than our senses lead us to believe. There is still a long road ahead, but along the way, the paradox and beauty of the quantum world remind us that the universe hides wonderful secrets waiting for us to have the courage to discover them. Imagine for a moment that everything that is true in the universe could eventually be known. It sounds optimistic, almost like a dream of science. There would be no truth that could resist us forever. However, Fitch's paradox gives us a surprising twist. According to this argument, if we assume that every truth is knowable in principle, we end up deducing that every truth must already be known, which is absurd. How do we move from such a reasonable claim as if something is true, it could be known someday, to the conclusion that then everything true is known here and now? That puzzle is what makes this paradox so striking. To understand it better, it helps to follow its reasoning step by step. The starting point is the idea that if something is true, it is at least possible to know it. Imagine any truth at all. For example, that somewhere in the universe there is a planet covered with turquoise seas. Even if today we do not have the technology to reach it and verify it, we can suppose that this truth is knowable. It would be enough to develop suitable instruments or travel far enough to discover it directly. This is the optimistic stance on access to knowledge. There are no truths that are in principle beyond our reach. The problem arises when we add another small step. We consider a truth of the form, "There is a truth that no one knows." If that statement were true, then according to the initial assumption, it should also be possible to know it. But how could one know a truth that says no one knows this truth? If someone discovers it, it ceases to be an unknown truth. It destroys itself at the very moment it is revealed. Thus, the apparent simplicity of every truth is knowable leads by pure logic to the conclusion that no unknown truth can exist, because upon being known, it stops being the truth that no one knew. Therefore, we conclude that all truths would already have to be in the chest of the known, and that is very hard to accept in practice. Of course, this paradox is not meant to tell you that in fact everything has already been discovered. Rather, it aims to show that the simple assumption that everything is knowable contains contradictions when we analyze it carefully. Some philosophers use this reasoning to criticize the idea that reality is completely transparent to the human mind. Others point out that perhaps the paradox can be resolved by being more precise about what we mean by knowable, or by distinguishing between the possibility of knowing something in theory and the actual human capacity to know it. In the midst of this landscape, it is worth remembering that this is not the first time philosophy has encountered puzzles about knowledge. Descartes, for example, posed a disturbing question. How can we be sure that there is not an all-powerful being, an evil genius that systematically distorts everything we perceive? If such a genius manipulated our senses, we could be mistaken even about what seems most obvious to us. According to Descartes, the only indubitable certainty is the awareness of existing itself. I think, therefore I exist. But everything else, at least in theory, would be susceptible to deception. In what way are these two challenges, Descartes's and Fichte's, similar? Both make us doubt the possibility of complete or absolutely secure knowledge, while Descartes raises the suspicion that we could be mistaken about almost any aspect of the external world. Fichte's paradox indicates that even under the assumption that truth is accessible, we end up cornered into the position that everything would already be known right now, something that is clearly not true in our daily experience. The evil genius serves to illustrate extreme skepticism. It may not be feasible to gather decisive proof against such a being, because any evidence you collect could be part of its deception. And Fichte's paradox shows a different dead end. If you cling to the idea that nothing remains hidden forever, you arrive at the conclusion that nothing is hidden now, which clashes with our intuition that there is still a great deal we do not know. Think about all the unexplored corners of the universe, the mysteries of the mind or of dark matter. For some thinkers, the solution lies in refining language. Perhaps it is a mistake to say all truths are knowable without exception. There could be truths that by their very nature self-destruct when discovered, or that require impossible conditions for their knowledge. Or perhaps the phrase, all truths are knowable, should be understood in a less literal way, as a regulative ideal. It is not that we can technically reach everything, but that we do not accept the existence of magical or intrinsically inaccessible truths. Another position says that the paradox is only possible because we are playing with a very special type of statement. This truth is known by no one. By taking it into the realm of logic, knowability, and knowledge, we generate a loop that bites its own tail. Similar to what happens with expressions like, "This sentence is false," or "I am a chronic liar, who is telling the truth right now." In all these cases, the paradox may indicate not so much a limit of reality, but a tangle in language and in our concepts. Whatever the case may be, Fichte's paradox invites us to reflect on what it means for something to be true, and how truths relate to the possibility of being discovered. It reminds us that even though in everyday life we take for granted that we can always learn something new, there may be logical or structural limits to what we can fully know. In a vast universe with infinite details, is it realistic to suppose that sooner or later we could access all information? Or will there be truths that, although they exist, never translate into human knowledge? At the same time, this tension between what we can know and what might remain hidden forever adds a note of humility to our desire to know. At the same time, it keeps the flame of curiosity alive. After all, the history of science and philosophy is full of truths that seemed impossible to reach centuries ago, and that, with new methods and theories, ended up being understood. It is good to remember that discovery is not only a matter of logic. Creativity, technological advances, and the human factor of motivation to explore also play a role. Perhaps, when you relax and let these ideas settle, you can imagine an infinite horizon full of enigmas. Each time you take one step forward, you marvel at something new, but at the same time, each step reveals another 100 mysteries you had not noticed before. In this way, Fichte's paradox and Descartes' skeptical vision come together. They remind us that there will always be a margin of doubt, and that every new piece of knowledge brings with it new questions. Maybe the key is not to reach all truths, but to enjoy the path we take to know them, knowing that reality is deeper than what we can grasp all at once. Thus, neither the hypothesis of an evil genius nor the apparently illogical conclusion of Fichte's paradox should discourage us from seeking the truth. Rather, each paradox and each thought experiment is an invitation to explore the boundaries of our beliefs and to remain open to what we have yet to discover. Will we ever fully map reality? Perhaps not. But the curiosity that drives us to try is in itself a valuable trait of our nature, one that keeps us moving forward with the hope that step by step we will make the world a little less unknown. Imagine that from one day to the next, you discover that everything you perceive could be the work of an incredibly powerful deceiving entity. It can manipulate light, sound, even your thoughts, so that every experience you believe you are living is nothing more than a carefully orchestrated illusion. This is what René Descartes refers to with the hypothesis of the deceiving demon, or Descartes' demon. In his work, this philosopher asks, what would happen if there existed a being so cunning that it made all our beliefs turn out to be false? Terrifying, without a doubt. But by proposing this extreme possibility, Descartes seeks to discover whether there is anything we can know with absolute certainty. Why imagine such a radical scenario? Descartes lived in a time of profound change, marked by scientific revolutions and clashes with tradition. Many pieces of knowledge that were taken for granted were questioned or even discarded when new data emerged. So he set out to find a secure foundation for knowledge, something that could withstand even the most extreme doubts. From this comes his argument of the deceiving demon. If such a being could falsify all our perceptions, it would have the power to deceive us about absolutely everything. In this way, Descartes examines the validity of what we believe we know. Imagine that you are in your room. You observe the walls, feel the texture of the sheet, and perceive your own breathing. According to Descartes, if the demon were powerful enough, it could make you believe in the existence of objects that are not really there. It could simulate heat, cold, the hardness of things. It could even falsify what we call mathematical truths, leading you to seemingly logical conclusions that are, deep down, erroneous. Under this influence, you could not trust what you see, hear, or smell, nor what you call numerical proofs or the lessons you learned in school. However, Descartes considers that there is an irreducible point in all this game of deception: doubt itself. No matter how ingenious this demon may be, or how many tricks it uses to confuse us, there always remains the inner experience of doubting. And if you doubt, it is a sign that you are aware that you exist as a subject who reflects. From this arises the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I exist." In Latin, cogito ergo sum. This is the firm pillar that Descartes finds even in the worst possible scenario, where a demon manipulates your senses and your reasoning. It cannot annul the fact that you, as a thinking being, are present. You might wonder why complicate things so much. Why imagine such a powerful, malevolent being? The reason is that through this extreme doubt, Descartes ensures that he accepts nothing that can be questioned. Once he discards the reliability of the senses, since they could be deceived, and also casts doubt on mathematical reasoning, since even there manipulation could occur, he arrives at the conclusion that only this indisputable intuition remains, that there is an I that doubts, that reflects, and therefore exists. In practice, this gave rise to what is called methodological doubt, a philosophical tool for examining our beliefs and arriving at what stands by its own evidence. It is not that Descartes literally believed in a demon that lies to us every second, but rather that he used this imaginary scenario as a kind of exercise to test the solidity of our knowledge. Once he affirms, "I think, therefore I exist," he feels he has overcome the first great barrier of skepticism. He then seeks other paths to demonstrate the existence of God and the external world, although not everyone has agreed with his later conclusions. It is worth noting that the idea of the deceiving demon bears some resemblance to other skeptical hypotheses. In science fiction, there is talk of simulation or virtual reality in which we might be immersed without knowing it. If a sufficiently advanced system generated each of our sensory stimuli, how would we distinguish the real from the artificial? The unease that Descartes raised in the 17th century is still alive today, perhaps with different technological nuances, but with the same underlying concern. How can I be sure that nothing is deceiving me? Another parallel is found in the so-called brain in a vat, a thought experiment proposed by modern philosophers. Imagine that everything you believe you're experiencing is the product of a series of electrical impulses sent to your brain. which would be floating in a container filled with nourishing substances. As with the deceiving demon, your brain could not discover whether what it perceives is real or a perfectly orchestrated illusion. Even so, the experience that there is a you who perceives and thinks does not vanish, even if the external world may be doubtful. Still, it is important not to confuse Descartes' methodological doubt with absolute nihilism. He does not remain in the abyss of thinking that nothing exists. On the contrary, he seeks precisely the cornerstone on which to rebuild certainty and considers that at least there exists someone who is being deceived or could be deceived. That someone, that thinking self, becomes the foundation of his philosophical system. The relevance of this reflection is not limited to the history of philosophy. In today's world, where fake news, media manipulation, and virtual environments are multiplying, the Cartesian question resurfaces with force. To what extent can we trust what reaches us through our senses and our screens? Although today we do not usually speak of a horned demon plotting against us, the essence of doubt still functions as an antidote to credulity. Remembering that appearances can deceive invites us to investigate, verify, and analyze in order to gradually approach more solid knowledge. Ultimately, Descartes' demon is a symbol, a mirror that reflects our vulnerability to error. By taking it to the extreme, it shows us that even if everything else were an illusion, the awareness of existing remains as a beacon, and if we start from that beacon, we can gradually illuminate other parts of reality, carefully and methodically distinguishing what seems true from what is mere appearance. We may never have an absolute guarantee that we are not in an illusion, but at least we have one firm point: the intimate experience of thinking, feeling, and being. Thus, this image of the deceiving demon remains alive in modern philosophy, not so much because of the literal threat of a malevolent entity, but because it reminds us of our capacity, and perhaps the need, to question what we believe we know. Sometimes letting go of superficial certainties is the first step toward building a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. And in that process, doubt becomes an ally, not an enemy, a way of keeping the flame of curiosity and intellectual perseverance alive. After all, if there is something that defines us as thinking beings, it is precisely the ability to examine our own experience, even if to do so we must imagine a demon whose deceptions put our convictions to the test at the very root.